Good morning. Welcome. This is Angela Coulter, your Consciousness Transformation Ascension Guide and originator of Trinity Energy Progression, bringing you this week's Living the Shift. Today, which is funny, it's funny this sort of fell on today because today is the 12-12-12 thing, right? And what was interesting was when I posted about this last night, I was talking like last week, I sort of got, this is what to talk about today, right? This is what to talk about today or tomorrow. And when I went into meditation this morning, I was like, so what was it I was supposed to talk about again? I don't even remember. I had to actually go and look at what I posted to see. And then I was like, oh, because I was thinking it was one thing. And of course, thinking and guidance are two completely different things sometimes. Good morning, Sarah. And so the space-time continuum thing. And I was like, okay, not quite sure where we're going with that, except, oh, well, it's interesting that it's 12, the 12-12-12 thing, and people are talking about that and whatnot. So I am, interesting way for it to fall, because I wasn't even thinking about that yesterday. So first of all, one thing I want to talk about is as we get more and more conscious, we stop. So like right now, as we have been getting more and more conscious and being more and more awakened and remembering our divine presence and all that kind of stuff, we start noticing collectively as well as individually, many have started noticing this time warp, right? This feeling of a time warp where like an hour might feel like 5 minutes, and then the next 5 minutes might feel like 3 hours. And then it's just this inconsistency of where we are in space and time. Many of us that I know, including myself, have a really challenging time sometimes staying within the confines of the calendar and the clock. Because the more we focus our consciousness beyond that, the more it feels so confining to say, okay, this has to be done here, this has to be done there, which when you run a business is funny because, I've got to look at my calendar and say, oh, I have to do my podcast this morning, or I have a session, or I have, a meeting or whatever. So many say, well, what is that about? Why does it feel so warped? Well, the first thing to remember is that we create the idea of space and time. And in separation, we've done that so that we can measure, that we can have, the basis of how we've created separation and duality or triality, however you want to look at it, is that we base one step on the step before it, right? So we do a lot of things based on propulsion, based on foundations, on things we've done before, and that we build on and continue, right? And to do that, we need some form of measurement on how we do that. And so we've decided time and space is how we're going to do that. Like, so in duality and separation, we've created these physical bodies. We have created laws of physics and gravity and, all kinds of different sciences, what we call sciences. And so we go into this whole, like we don't realize how much our days are completely managed by what we have decided is space and time. We've decided. Now listen to that. So the funny thing is when I talk to people about time doesn't really exist. Time only exists as we choose for it to, and as we choose to play in it too. So that's why I think when we get into more, and here's a great example, and I've talked about this many times. So here's a great example. We here on this planet have had oodles and oodles of different characters, calendars. And they change depending on who's, in charge, who's ruling. Our calendar, the Gregorian calendar is a mess because it was all created through egos of different rulers. And no, this month I need to add a month in with my name, and I need to add a month in because of this belief or whatever. And so, but we follow it, and we haven't equalized it. It's, inconsistent, right? Every month has a different number of days and all that kind of stuff. So we measure, say, what we decide are years, right? Which is the years, what we decide is a year is how long it takes for us to travel around the sun. but that's only a really sort of microscopic piece of the bigger picture, right? Yes, that's a cycle of ours. We also look at like months from full moon to full moon. That's another way we look at it, as how the moon cycles around us. So what's really interesting is, so like what many don't think about, right? And I said, so if time is so, if time is so real, then why would it be subjective to your location? One of the points that I always bring up is like, if you are watching Star Wars, right? And they talk about, this is a great one, Star Wars, and they talk about somewhere in there, Yoda is this many years old. I don't know, 600, 700 something, 800 years old. And I'm like, so by what calendar? Because by the way, Yoda doesn't live on Earth. So why would he use the Gregorian calendar? Because he has no idea about that. And so if we were on Mars and we decided that a year must be, measured the same way by how long it rotates around the sun, we'd be a lot older. Or Mercury, we'd be a lot older. If we were, say, in Jupiter or Neptune, we'd be a lot younger if we measured in the same way. So the thing is that shows you how time is really relative. And it's like, oh, well, we have, this many minutes. Well, we've split it up so that we can base our, measurement around that. And it's, like I said, it's changed. There was the Mayan calendar, there's the Chinese calendar, there's been many, many other calendars all along the way based on all different kinds of measurements. So that's something for us to remember as we go along, is that time is only created based on how we choose to measure. So therefore, when we put weight on certain dates, because of the numbers that they create, so like for today, like a lot of people are doing, 12, 12, 12, and there's special this and there's special that, and it's whatever, and it's like, okay, but that's still duality based. It's still saying that one moment is more important or less important than the other, that only this moment at 12, 12, 12 at 12, 12 a.m., which it would have been, no, it would have been 12, 12, it would have been noon, whatever, that's like a special moment of a special gateway. And it's like, but that's still duality and ego based, saying that one moment is more important than the other. And it also deals with us looking at, well, it's all for us to get to the same space, and we can do that outside of space and time because we are in the same space. Because outside of space and time, there is no time, obviously. So when we start looking at that way, like for example, I do my other podcast on Mondays with Sarah Evignoni, who's here, and we do an energy share together at the end of every podcast. It's called Ascended World. So if you haven't listened, it's all advanced perceptions and discussions on collective consciousness and collective energy and where we are and what's coming up. And anyway, so we always do a share at the end of the podcast. And anybody who comes and watches a podcast, whether it's an hour later, 2 days later, 5 weeks later, 6 years later, it doesn't matter. You can still tune into that moment outside of space and time and join us in that, because that is the time and space for you physically, for where you are ready, willing, and able to accept that or be a part of that, or everything else is aligned for that. And so that's when we talk about energy work and quantum physics and things like that, because there is no time when it comes to that kind of stuff. So the more we start to live and breathe and express in higher consciousness, the less these numbers, these dates or whatever, start to really mean individually, because it just becomes another moment. And all those moments, by the way, without duality, they are all perfect and divine, and activations or doorways or whatever we want to call them. So we can put importance on it to help focus our energy. Absolutely. Right. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with any of this. This is just something to give you some space for different kinds of thoughts. Right. So there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, we're going to focus all our energy on this moment. Right. and by the way, it's like, okay, so 12, 12, 12 at 12, 12 p.m. is different for everyone. So in what time zone, right? Because we have time zones. And so then what's the real one? Is it just Greenwich Mean Time, which means that would have been at 6:12 a.m. here in the East, on the East Coast of the United States. So the thing is, and so essentially when people are doing that, we're like, okay, so it's 12, 12, 12 where I am at this moment. And so therefore I'm going to focus my energy here. Well, that is actually working outside of space and time and saying, okay, I'm just going to use that as a guideline of how to focus my energy or when to focus my energy, because it gets the mind. It does essentially get the mind out of the way a lot of times. But the thing that's really important is to keep that in mind, to know that we are not defined by the moment, but we define the moment. There's a big difference there, right? So we're not victim to, oh my God, I have to drop everything and I have to do this right now because it's this day and time and whatever, which we do in day-to-day life, which is funny. Or, but instead we can say, okay, energetically, okay, I'm going to focus my energy and I will take that guideline to be, okay, outside of space and time. When I can do it, I will just connect in. I will tell you that the more we start to live that way, and with that full consciousness that we are not victims to time, but that we are the creators of it, then we stop being confined by it. And that's where our perceptions of it getting really warped start to happen. Like, I don't know, it's so much for me, it's so much in every moment right now that like a day can feel like a week. I think last week, because there was just so many downloads and openings and things building on each other that were coming in that were huge. It felt like last week was about 6 months worth of stuff. And here we are, it's only a week later. And yet, then I'll go another week and it'll feel like it was 5 minutes. So that's the thing to really remember. That's really key. I'm not a slave to time. Time is my creation. If I choose to use it, as my guideline, right? To get my mind out of the way. Okay, that's fine. But, something happening because it's 12, 12, 12 is so subjective. And it's actually just often it's just a distraction, right? The key is to take the numbers, and yes, we use them as messages, right? So people talk about like, repeating numbers and all that kind of stuff. Yes. So we can use those things as messages. But then we try to then apply them to things like dates and times and everything else, which sometimes we can do, but then it becomes very personally relevant to every person. So there's like, I think it was, I can't remember who it was that did the whole thing on the angel numbers, whatever. I think it was Story and Virtue, but the 111s and the 222s and all that kind of stuff, like the 12, 12, 12 and all that. And to me, so the way I look at it is, okay, it's great to see as a guideline and to get to the basis if this is what a message would be, in relation to this, or something for me to look at for within me. But I found that some of the things are very personal to me and has nothing to do with what the book says, right? Or what I look it up online. And I always tell people, absolutely, if you need to use a reference as a tool, that's great. But then ask your own guidance. Is this what it means for me? Because that's what's really important, right? So that's something to just keep in mind as we go down this path. It's like, okay, yeah, we acknowledge higher consciousness, but then we sort of become a slave to these, and I don't want to say it in a judgmental way, but like sort of a dog and pony show in many ways. It's like, oh, you got to do this for the 888 and you got to do this for the 999. And, there's all that kind of stuff. And it's like all subjective, right? So remember that and say, like I like to feel my way through via energy, right? And if it feels like, usually we can feel the energy of something rumbling. We can feel the energy of a doorway opening collectively. We can feel the energy of, huge shifting coming or shifting going on. And we can apply that if we want to put it for a mark point. We can put it on a date and time. Absolutely. But that is just for reference and not for absolute, reality kind of thing. So think about that, and then think about how we look at things. Because when we look at the bigger picture, so getting away from that, when we look at the bigger picture more and more often, then we start seeing things across time, not indifferently. What's the word I'm looking for? We see things across time that are all consistent. And it actually becomes easier to see the bigger picture without limiting ourselves through the confines of time. So when we look at the bigger picture, so for example, when we stop, so an example that we look at is multiple lifetimes, parallel timelines, things like that. When we start being able to look at that kind of stuff, then we can see themes, lessons that we've chosen to learn, experiences, the bigger story of what it is that you came here to do. We'll start doing that through like seeing things or patterns through multiple timelines, through multiple ages, and not really seeing things, but feeling them, because really it's the energy of them that continues on. And in essence, that's really the seeing and discussing and the words around it are superfluous, because that's a tool of translation that we put in. So the more we go, the more we start to see things without those limitations. Well, and it becomes a little confusing to the mind, because the mind wants to say, we're so used to measuring, right? And then we're like, well, wait a second. And that's where we get confused. Did that happen last week or 6 months ago? Did that happen 2 months ago or 5 years from now? And I've had those moments. I've had many of those moments. And some people get sort of like analytical, and they're like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm getting dementia, or I've got to get checked out. And really, more times than not, it's really learning how to live outside of that space and time. What was a great movie that I talk about all the time that everybody should watch was Arrival, that had this kind of perception in there. Arrival was incredible. And I hate even talking about it, because if you haven't seen it, I don't want to ruin it for you, because it's really incredibly made movie. And I've seen it so many times. But in essence, it's this whole experience of humans here on Earth meeting star beings that come here that live from a very different perspective, from the perspective that time is circular. So there's no past and no future. It just is a circular thing, and you can see it all in one moment. And how do you communicate with somebody if we are very linear and finite, when you're communicating with someone who perceives the multiverse from a circular standpoint, because you're speaking completely different languages, completely different perceptions? And so that's what is amazing about that movie. I would say I've sort of spoiled it if you haven't watched it, but it's still worth watching. And so because then it just becomes, well, then what is time, right? What's the question? The question is, what is time? If we can see the whole circle of the future and the past and how it all ties together in totality and wholeness, well, then what purpose does it serve where it falls on the timeline? It just does. It's a little mind-blowing to try to think about it, but it was really well illustrated in Arrival. Amy Adams, I believe. There's a lot of good names in that movie as well. So like, that's a perfect example of us expanding our consciousness beyond, limiting ourselves by staying stuck in the space-time continuum of that is where we have to function, and that everything that we do has to be, relative to that particular experience of the space and time of that moment. And so we can, again, as a reminder, like, we can say, I'm going to choose for this moment to be relevant or a catalyst or a a focus time. Like, so for example, with the Trinity Energy Progression group, I used to do like every Sunday night, we would meet out in the ethers, right? And I would say outside of space and time. So to put it on your calendar, to do something so that you surely focus your energy on it every Sunday night at 9 p.m. your time, wherever you are, meet us out there. And if you can't, that's fine. Just go outside of space and time and meet us out there anyway. And we'll do a group thing, which is probably a good thing to start doing again, because it's just good for us to get together and outside of space and time really join our efforts, right? So that's really what a lot of these like gateway things sort of do. Like many talk about, oh, well, there's this activation, there's this, special thing that comes in, and it's like, but you can get that at any time. So you can get that now. Like you can go out there and be like, okay, so whatever that is, I want that now. You can do that. It's only a matter of how you believe or whether you believe you can or not. So take a look at all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of things that we do that we don't even realize how we are so dependent on those measurements and on those boxes. And let's free ourselves. If we're freeing our minds, right, to accept our higher consciousness, right? So we're going beyond our mind, then let's get out of our mind needing to measure everything and control everything based on dates and times and whatever. Dates and times and places. When we start focusing our attentions on these circular or the endless existence of every moment, and everything is all in a moment. Sorry, I got distracted with there was this beautiful leaf that was sort of dancing outside the window. It was weird. When we get stuck outside of I just totally lost my train of thought. Sorry. The leaf took me away. Took me to some other place in time, obviously. But the more that we focus on existing in wholeness within ourselves and as the divine whole, the more we realize it's really, excuse my yawn, it's really irrelevant to really limit ourselves by having to force ourselves to abide by certain things within the time and space continuum. I have communications with people all the time. Here's a really interesting experience of this. And this wasn't even me, but it was a great example. Actually, I have a number for me, but this was a great example that just popped into my mind. So there was somebody that I knew, very conscious, lovely individual who fell sick and almost died several years ago. And so she was in the hospital for, I think, like a month, and had these very interesting experiences of sort of seeing and hearing some of the things that were going on around her, even though she was unconscious for a good portion of it. So fast. And she said she remembers saying things, and she was out there and couldn't speak because she was so like unconscious or whatever here, but she was wanting to tell the doctor certain things. She was wanting to have them do certain things, and they weren't listening because she couldn't speak here, right? And so, but needless to say, it all got taken care of. She got better, whatever. So here is a year later, I think it was a year later. And a group of us were in Mount Shasta, and we were doing a group meditation. And a group, not a meditation, but a group, what we call a vortex. We're doing a group session, and this woman was there, and she was in the center of the circle. And so one person in the circle saw this whole thing Like, and she didn't know the whole story of what the other one had gone through, but she saw her in the hospital. She saw the stuff that was going on, and she was helping to get the message through the doctors to get certain things done. And she's like, I didn't even understand what was going on. But so here it is a year later, and she's helping this woman with what she was having problems communicating like a year before. I'm pretty sure it was a year, or it might have been a couple months. I can't even remember. Again, time and space. But it was after the fact. So it was like moving forward in time to help somebody behind in time, because there is no limitation on the linear, like when we take away the linearity of it. So, and I see that happening all the time, like things that, like you remember having a conversation. That's the whole thing. Oh, that's the whole thing about Arrival. Like if you haven't watched it, really do that. That's the home play for this week. Go watch the movie Arrival if you haven't. And if you have, just watch it again for fun, because it is such an awesome movie. But if we allow ourselves the freedom, right, then we can be like, oh, okay, well, I do this in 10 years, or I did this 10 years ago. I can go help myself. Like I had a big circular moment a couple of weeks ago where I remembered hearing myself talking to me from now back 10 years ago. That was pretty cool. So that kind of stuff, when we stop living under the confines of like that space and time thing and believing that that's how we have to live, that's how we have to focus all of our energy, then we stay limited to some degree. So play with that this week. Say, okay, if I allowed myself to experience and exist outside of space and time, what would that look like? And open your heart and allow all possibilities. and see how it comes. And stop. And it's time for us to focus our energies on that more than, okay, I'm going to create this, or I'm going to have to create this, or there's got to be this, or, you can go up online and there's everybody saying, oh, there's activations and gateway openings and this and that, whatever. It doesn't even matter. If you're not there, it doesn't matter. You can go outside there, outside of space and time, and you can access whatever energy it is to come in to remember, because there's nothing you don't already have. It's just what you've remembered, and access for yourself. It's that easy. As we take away that separation and that, somebody's more special than the other because they have more information than the other, but it's like, actually, it's all what you remember in the moment, and we all can access it. It's just when we're ready to. So allow that to settle in, play with that this week, watch the movie Arrival if you can, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me. This is Angela Coulter signing out with this week's Living the Shift. Have a great one.